I'm Maya Rodriguez, and I never imagined that lending my twin sister my credit card for a weekend emergency would lead to her stealing my entire identity, maxing out 17 different accounts, and ultimately costing me everything I'd worked for. What started as sisterly compassion turned into a nightmare that destroyed my credit, my reputation, and nearly my sanity. But here's the twist nobody saw coming, including Jessica herself. When I discovered the full extent of her deception, I made a decision that shocked everyone, especially when the debt collectors started calling her instead of me. Growing up in Phoenix, Arizona, people always assumed Jessica and I were identical twins, but we weren't. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. We were fraternal twins who happened to look remarkably similar, especially when we wore our hair the same way. Our mother, Carmen Rodriguez, worked double shifts as a hospital administrator while our father, Miguel, ran a small auto repair shop on the south side of town. Money was always tight, but our parents made sure we understood the value of hard work and education. From the very beginning, though, Jessica and I were different in ways that went far beyond our DNA. While I spent afternoons at the kitchen table with homework spread across every surface, Jessica would be on the phone with friends, planning her next social adventure. When I saved every dollar from my part-time job at the local grocery store, Jessica spent her babysitting money on makeup and clothes before she even got home. Our parents often joked that they'd somehow raised a saver and a spender, never realizing how prophetic those words would become. In high school, these differences became more pronounced. I maintained a 4 GPA while juggling shifts at the store and volunteering at the community center. My goal was clear: earn enough scholarships to attend Arizona State University and study accounting. Numbers made sense to me in a way that people often didn't. There was comfort in the predictability of mathematics, in the way debits and credits always balanced, in the logical progression of financial planning. Jessica, meanwhile, seemed to float through high school on charm and charisma. She wasn't a bad student, maintaining solid B's and B+ grades, but her real talent was in reading people, understanding what they wanted to hear, and making them feel special. Teachers loved her because she asked engaging questions and participated enthusiastically in class discussion. Students gravitated toward her because she had an uncanny ability to make everyone feel like they were her best friend. Our differences created an interesting dynamic at home. While I was naturally introverted and methodical, Jessica was spontaneous and social. She could walk into any room and immediately become the center of attention, not through attention-seeking behavior, but through genuine interest in others and an infectious enthusiasm for life. I admired this about her, even as I recognized that we were fundamentally different people. During our senior year, these differences led to our first real conflict over money. I had been saving for months to buy a used car, carefully budgeting every dollar, and researching the best deals. Finally, I found a reliable Honda Civic with low mileage that was within my budget. The day before I was supposed to make the purchase, Jessica came to me in tears. Her boyfriend had broken up with her, and she desperately wanted to attend a concert in Tucson with her friends to help her feel better. The ticket cost exactly the amount I had left over after the car purchase, money I'd planned to keep as an emergency fund. Jessica didn't ask directly for the money. Instead, she talked about how isolated she felt, how this breakup had made her question everything about herself, and how much it would mean to have this one night with her friends to remember what happiness felt like. She never said the words, "Can you lend me money?" but the implication hung in the air between us. I gave her the money, not because I was naive about getting it back, but because I genuinely wanted to help my sister feel better. The car could wait another month. My emergency fund could be rebuilt. But Jessica's emotional well-being felt more important in that moment than my financial plans. She never paid me back, not because she was malicious, but because she seemed to genuinely forget about the debt once the emotional crisis had passed. When I finally brought it up 6 weeks later, she was surprised that I expected repayment. "I thought it was a gift," she said, not defensively, but with genuine confusion. Sisters help each other, right? That conversation taught me something important about Jessica's relationship with money. and obligation. It wasn't that she was intentionally manipulative or dishonest. Rather, she seemed to exist in a world where emotional needs trumped financial responsibilities, where relationships were more important than transactions, and where the concept of formal debt between family members felt unnecessarily rigid. I bought a different car the following month, one that was slightly less reliable, and cost a bit more because I'd missed the original deal. It wasn't a financial catastrophe, but it was my first real lesson in how Jessica's approach to money could affect my carefully laid plan. College separated us for the first time in our lives. I attended Arizona State on a partial academic scholarship, supplemented by student loans that I calculated carefully to ensure I could pay them back within 5 years of graduation. I chose a practical major, lived in the most affordable dorm, and worked 20 hours a week at the campus bookstore to minimize my debt load. Jessica chose Northern Arizona University in Flagstaff, drawn by the beautiful campus and active social scene. She majored in communications, which seemed perfect for her people skills, though she changed her focus area 3 times during her 4 years. She lived in the nicest dorm available, joined a sorority, and seemed to embrace every aspect of college life with the same enthusiasm she brought to everything else. We stayed in touch through weekly phone calls and text messages, but our lives were diverging in ways that became more apparent each time we came home for holiday. I would arrive with detailed budgets showing how I'd allocated every dollar of my earnings, excited to share how I'd managed to pay down my student loans ahead of schedule. Jessica would arrive with stories of amazing experiences, new friends, and opportunities that had stretched her budget, but created memories she wouldn't trade for anything. Our parents handled these differences with a kind of resigned acceptance. They were proud of both of us, recognizing that Jessica's social intelligence was just as valuable as my financial discipline, even if they worried more about her long-term stability. During family dinners, they would listen to my updates about internships and budget achievements, with the same attention they gave to Jessica's stories about study abroad applications and sorority leadership roles. The summer after our sophomore year, these different approaches to life created another financial friction point. I had secured a paid internship at a mid-sized accounting firm in Phoenix, which would provide valuable experience and help me pay for the following year's expenses. Jessica had been accepted for an unpaid internship at a marketing company in Los Angeles, which would give her incredible experience but required her to somehow support herself in one of the most expensive cities in the country. She asked our parents for help first, but they simply couldn't afford to subsidize a summer in Los Angeles, while also helping with our regular college expenses. That's when Jessica approached me with a proposal that seemed reasonable on the surface. Could she borrow money to cover her living expenses for the summer, which she would pay back once she graduated and found a full-time job? The amount wasn't insignificant, nearly $3,000 to cover rent, food and basic expenses for 3 months. For me, that represented the majority of what I hoped to save from my summer internship. But Jessica presented a compelling case. The internship could lead to a full-time job offer which would put her in a much better position to pay back the loan. The experience would be invaluable for her career, and most importantly, she had never asked me for anything this significant before. I said yes, but this time I insisted we formalize the agreement. I created a simple promissory note outlining the loan amount, a reasonable interest rate, and a repayment schedule that would begin 6 months after her graduation. Jessica signed it willingly, even enthusiastically, thanking me repeatedly for believing in her and making her dreams possible. The summer went well for both of us. I gained valuable experience at the accounting firm, and even received an offer to return the following summer. Jessica thrived in Los Angeles, making connections in the marketing world and gaining hands-on experience with campaigns for several major brands. Her social media posts showed her exploring the city, attending industry events, and building relationships that seemed likely to benefit her career for years to come. When we returned to school in the fall, I felt good about the loan. It had been a worthwhile investment in my sister's future, and the formal agreement gave me confidence that I would be repaid according to our schedule. Jessica continued to express gratitude for my support, often mentioning how the summer had changed her perspective on her career goals and given her confidence to pursue more ambitious opportunities. However, as the months passed, I began to notice changes in Jessica's spending habits that concerned me. She had always been more casual about money than I was, but during junior year, her expenses seemed to escalate significantly. She moved out of the dorms into an expensive off-campus apartment, explaining that she needed the space and privacy to focus on her senior project. She bought a newer car when her old one started having mechanical problems, choosing a model that was reliable but significantly more expensive than necessary. Most concerning were the smaller purchases that seemed to add up: frequent dining out, regular shopping trips, and what appeared to be an increasingly expensive social life. When I gently asked about her budget during one of our phone calls, Jessica brushed off my concerns with her characteristic optimism. "I'm investing in relationships and experiences," she said. "My professors always say that networking is just as important as grades and communication. I can't build professional relationships if I'm constantly worried about spending $20 on coffee or lunch with potential mentors." Her logic wasn't entirely wrong. Jessica had always been better at building relationships than I was, and those connections had opened doors for her that pure academic achievement might not have. But from my accounting perspective, her spending seemed unsustainable. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Especially with a $3,000 debt already hanging over her post-graduation finances. During spring break of our junior year, Jessica came home with an announcement that both excited and worried our parents. She had been offered an opportunity to spend the fall semester of senior year studying abroad in Barcelona, Spain. The program was prestigious and would provide incredible experience in international marketing, but it was also expensive, requiring additional funds beyond what our parents had budgeted for her education. Once again, Jessica found herself needing financial help to pursue an opportunity that could significantly benefit her career, and once again she approached me with a request that seemed both reasonable and concerning. Could I help her cover the additional costs for the study abroad program, which she would add to her existing debt and pay back according to an extended schedule after graduation? This time I hesitated. The additional amount was significant, nearly $5,000 on top of the existing $3,000 loan. My own financial situation was stable, and I had been saving money throughout college, but lending this much would represent a major portion of my accumulated savings. More importantly, I was beginning to worry about Jessica's ability to manage the total debt load she would be carrying after graduation. But Jessica was persuasive in the way that only she could be. She had already been accepted to the program and would forfeit her spot if she couldn't secure funding within 2 weeks. The experience would set her apart from other job candidates when she graduated. She had already been in contact with several international marketing firms that actively recruited from this specific program. Most convincingly, she had calculated that the higher starting salary she could command with international experience would more than offset the additional debt within her first year of employment. Against my better financial judgment, but motivated by my love for my sister and my belief in her potential, I agreed to the additional loan. We updated our promissory note to reflect the new total amount and extended repayment schedule. Jessica was grateful to the point of tears, promising that she would never forget my support and would pay back every penny with interest once she was established in her career. The study abroad semester was everything Jessica had hoped it would be. Her social media posts showed her immersing herself in Spanish culture, working on marketing campaigns for European brands, and building an international network of contacts. She seemed to be thriving academically and socially, gaining experiences that would indeed set her apart from other recent graduates. Meanwhile, I continued with my methodical approach to college and career preparation. I maintained my high GPA, completed another successful summer internship, and even received a preliminary job offer from a respected accounting firm in Phoenix, contingent on my graduation and passing the CPA exam. My financial situation remained stable, though my savings account was significantly depleted by the loans to Jessica. As we approached graduation, I felt optimistic about both of our futures. I had a clear career path and the financial discipline to build a stable life. Jessica had gained incredible experiences and built relationships that seemed likely to open doors in the marketing world. The money I had lent her represented an investment in family and in her potential, and I was confident that she would honor our agreement once she was earning a professional salary. Graduation weekend was a celebration for our entire family. Our parents were proud to see both of their daughters completing college, and they made sure to acknowledge how we had supported each other throughout the process. During the family dinner after our ceremonies, our father made a toast that still resonates with me, to Maya and Jessica, who have shown us that success comes in many forms, and that the strongest families are those where everyone lifts each other up. In that moment, surrounded by family and full of hope for the future, I felt like our different approaches to life had balanced each other perfectly. I had provided financial stability and careful planning, while Jessica had pursued experiences and relationships that enriched both of our lives. The loans I had made felt like wise investments in our shared success. Within a month of graduation, reality began to set in for both of us. I started my position at the accounting firm and quickly fell into a routine that utilized all of my skills and training. The work was challenging and rewarding, and my starting salary was exactly what I had expected based on my research and planning. I moved into a modest apartment, created a detailed budget, and began the systematic process of paying down my student loans while building my professional career. Jessica's transition to post-graduation life was more complicated. Despite her optimism and networking efforts, the job market for communications majors was more competitive than she had anticipated. The international experience and relationships she had built were valuable, but converting them into immediate employment proved challenging. Several promising opportunities fell through at the last minute, and others turned out to be unpaid internships rather than the full-time positions she needed. After 3 months of job searching, Jessica finally accepted a position with a small marketing firm in Scottsdale. The job was in her field and offered growth potential, but the starting salary was significantly lower than what she had projected when we calculated her loan repayment schedule. When I asked how this would affect her ability to begin payments, Jessica asked if we could defer the start of repayment by 6 months to give her time to establish herself and potentially earn raises or bonus. I agreed to the deferment, understanding that entry-level positions often required time to develop into stable career foundations. However, I also suggested that we should discuss adjusting the payment amounts to match her actual income rather than her projected income. Jessica assured me that wouldn't be necessary, as she was confident her salary would increase quickly once her employers recognized her value. During this period, Jessica moved into an apartment that seemed expensive for her salary level, but she explained that location was crucial for networking in her industry. She needed to be accessible to clients and colleagues, and the extra cost was an investment in her career advance. While this logic wasn't entirely unreasonable, I began to worry that Jessica was still thinking about money in the same optimistic way that had characterized her college years, rather than adapting to the realities of entry-level employment. 6 months later, when the deferment period ended, Jessica requested another extension. Her salary had not increased as quickly as she had hoped, and she had encountered some unexpected expenses related to her work wardrobe and transportation. She was making progress in her career and building valuable relationships, but the financial reality of her situation was more challenging than either of us had anticipated. This time, I pushed back more firmly. While I understood that career development took time, I also needed to see some progress toward repayment, even if it was smaller amounts than originally planned. We agreed on a modified payment schedule that would begin immediately with reduced monthly amounts, to be adjusted upward as her income increased. For the next year, Jessica made sporadic payments that were usually less than the amounts we had agreed upon. Each payment came with an explanation: unexpected car repairs, medical bills, work expenses, or temporary cash flow problems. None of these explanations were unreasonable in isolation, but the pattern was concerning from my perspective as both a creditor and assistant. More troubling than the irregular payments was what appeared to be a continued pattern of expensive lifestyle choices that seemed inconsistent with Jessica's actual income. Her social media post showed frequent dining out, weekend trips, and purchases that suggested she was living well beyond what I knew her salary could support. When I gently raised these concerns, Jessica became defensive, explaining that her job required her to maintain a certain image, and that networking expenses were investments in her future earning potential. Our parents occasionally asked about the loan arrangement, and I found myself in the uncomfortable position of downplaying the repayment problems to avoid family conflict. I didn't want to damage Jessica's relationship with our parents, and I hoped that her financial situation would stabilize as her career progressed. However, I was beginning to realize that our different approaches to money might be more fundamentally incompatible than I had originally understood. 2 years after graduation, Jessica announced that she was leaving her job to start her own marketing consultancy. She explained that she had built enough relationships and gained enough experience to strike out on her own, and that the potential income from her own business far exceeded what she could earn as an employee. When I asked how this career change would affect her loan repayments, Jessica assured me that her earning potential would actually increase significantly once she was working for herself. In reality, Jessica's transition to entrepreneurship created even more financial instability. Building a client base took longer than she had anticipated, and the irregular income from consulting work made budgeting and loan payments even more unpredictable. For several months, she made no payments at all, explaining that she was reinvesting everything back into the business, and that larger payments would resume once her client base was established. During this period, I began to question whether I had made a fundamental error in lending money to someone whose approach to financial management was so different from my own. It wasn't that Jessica was dishonest or malicious. She genuinely seemed to believe that her career trajectory would eventually enable her to repay the loan with interest. But her optimism about future earning potential was consistently outpacing the reality of her actual financial situation. 3 years after graduation, the total amount Jessica owed me, including the agreed-upon interest, had grown to nearly $10,000. She had paid back less than $2,000 in irregular installments, and the gap between what she owed and what she had paid was widening rather than closing. More concerning was the fact that she seemed to have stopped viewing the debt as a priority, often going months without mentioning it unless I brought it up directly. It was around this time that Jessica met Ryan, the man who would eventually become her husband. Ryan was a successful real estate agent with a stable income and an optimistic outlook that matched Jessica's perfectly. They fell in love quickly and began talking about marriage within 6 months of meeting. I was happy for Jessica personally, but I also hoped that Ryan's financial stability might bring some balance to her approach to money management. When Jessica announced their engagement after dating for 10 months, I decided it was time to have a serious conversation about the outstanding loan. With marriage on the horizon, both Jessica and Ryan needed to understand all of their financial obligations, and I needed to know how the debt would be handled going forward. I suggested that we formalize a new repayment plan that would work within their combined household budget. Jessica's response surprised and disappointed me. She explained that she and Ryan were focused on saving for their wedding and future together, and that repaying the loan to me wasn't a priority compared to building their new life. She suggested that since I was doing well financially and didn't seem to need the money immediately, perhaps we could continue with the flexible arrangement indefinitely. This conversation was a turning point in my understanding of how Jessica viewed our financial relation. It became clear that she had never really internalized the loan as a serious obligation, but rather saw it as a form of family support that was nice to repay when convenient, but not essential to her financial plan. The fact that I had been willing to be flexible with payments and deferrals had apparently convinced her that the debt was more of a suggestion than a binding agreement. I realized that I had to make a choice: continue enabling Jessica's casual approach to the debt, potentially damaging both our financial and personal relationship, or take a firmer stance that might create family conflict but would establish clear boundaries. The decision was complicated by the fact that Jessica seemed genuinely unaware of how her attitude toward the loan was affecting me, both financially and emotionally. What I didn't know at the time was that Jessica's casual approach to financial obligations extended far beyond our family loan. As I would discover in the most shocking way possible, she had been making financial decisions that would ultimately affect not just her own future but mine as well, in ways that I could never have imagined. The first sign that something was seriously wrong came on a Tuesday morning in March when I received a call from my bank's fraud department. I was reviewing quarterly reports at my desk when my phone buzzed with an unknown number. The voice on the other end was professional but urgent, asking me to verify several recent transactions on my credit card that appeared suspicious. According to the fraud specialist, someone had used my card to make multiple purchases in Las Vegas over the weekend, including a hotel stay at the Bellagio, expensive dinners, and shopping sprees that totaled nearly $4,000. The problem was, I had been home in Phoenix all weekend, working on tax preparations for several clients, and reorganizing my home office. My immediate assumption was that my card had been skimmed or that someone had managed to steal my information through online fraud. This kind of identity theft was becoming increasingly common, and I had always been careful about protecting my financial information. I assured the bank representative that these transactions were fraudulent, and requested that the charges be reversed and a new card issued immediately. However, as the bank representative read through the transaction details, something struck me as odd. The purchases weren't random or typical of most credit card fraud. Instead of quick cash advances or purchases at easily liquidated retailers, these transactions showed a pattern of someone who was comfortable using my card for leisure activities. The hotel reservation had been made under my name, not some random alien. The restaurant charges were at upscale establishments where someone had clearly taken time to enjoy full meals rather than making quick purchases. When I asked for more specific details about the transactions, the bank representative mentioned that the card had been used with the correct PIN number for several cash advances, which suggested that whoever was using it had intimate knowledge of my account information. This detail made me pause, because I had only ever shared my PIN with one person in my entire life. 2 years earlier, when Jessica was going through a particularly difficult financial period during her transition to self-employment, I had given her my debit card and PIN to withdraw money for groceries during a week when her business checking account was temporarily frozen due to a banking error. It was meant to be a one-time emergency assistance, and she had returned the card the same day, but she had necessarily learned my PIN during that transaction. The thought that Jessica might be responsible for these fraudulent charges seemed impossible at first. Despite our ongoing issues with the loan repayment, I couldn't imagine her actually stealing from me. Using my card without permission would be a criminal act, not just a family financial disagreement. Surely she wouldn't cross that line, especially when she knew how seriously I took financial responsibility and trust. But as I reflected on the timing and location of the charges, more concerning coincidences emerged. Jessica had mentioned on social media that she was attending a marketing conference in Las Vegas that same weekend. She had posted photos from what appeared to be the same hotel where my credit card had been charged. The timing of the transactions aligned perfectly with her travel schedule, and the amounts were consistent with the kind of expenses someone might incur during a business conference weekend. I decided to investigate further before making any accusation. Through careful examination of Jessica's social media posts from that weekend, I could piece together a timeline that matched almost perfectly with the fraudulent charges on my account. A photo of her having dinner at an expensive steakhouse was posted at nearly the same time my card was charged at that exact restaurant. Pictures of shopping bags from luxury stores corresponded with charges that had appeared on my statement. The evidence was circumstantial, but compelling. However, I still couldn't bring myself to believe that Jessica would deliberately steal from me. There had to be some other explanation. Perhaps she had accidentally grabbed my card instead of hers when she was rushing to catch her flight. Maybe she had been confused about which card she was using during the stress of business travel. Surely when she realized the mistake, she would contact me immediately to explain and arrange reimbursement. I waited 3 days for Jessica to reach out about the mix-up, but she never called. During that time, I watched her social media posts from the Las Vegas trip, which showed her enjoying expensive meals, shopping trips, and entertainment that I now knew had been charged to my credit card. There was no indication in her posts or behavior that she realized she had made any kind of mistake with payment methods. Finally, I decided to call her directly. My approach was gentle and non-accusatory, giving her every opportunity to explain what had happened. I mentioned that I had received some unusual charges on my credit card from Las Vegas, and wondered if she might have accidentally used my card instead of hers during her business trip. Jessica's response was immediate and seemed genuinely confused. She assured me that she had used her own business credit card for all expenses during the conference, as she always did for tax deduction purposes. She suggested that perhaps someone had skimmed my card information at a restaurant or store, and that the Las Vegas charges were just a coincidence of timing. Her explanation sounded reasonable and was delivered with apparent sincerity. However, something about her response felt rehearsed, as though she had been prepared for this conversation. When I mentioned specific restaurants and stores where charges had appeared, she showed no recognition or surprise, even though these were places she had clearly visited based on her social media posts. A truly innocent person would have been amazed by the coincidence and eager to help figure out how someone could have used my card at the exact same places she had been. I decided to test her response by providing more specific detail. I mentioned that the fraudulent charges had been made with my correct PIN number, which should have prompted questions about how that information could have been compromised. Instead, Jessica quickly deflected the conversation to general warnings about identity theft and the importance of monitoring credit reports regularly. Her lack of curiosity about the specific details of the fraud, combined with the overwhelming evidence that she had been at the exact locations where my card was used, convinced me that she was indeed responsible for the charges. The realization was devastating, not just because of the financial theft, but because it meant that Jessica had looked me in the eye and lied about it when confronted. I spent several sleepless nights trying to understand how Jessica could have justified this action to herself. Was she so desperate for money that she felt stealing from me was her only option? Did she view it as an advance against the money she already owed me? Had she convinced herself that since I was financially stable, a few $1,000s wouldn't really hurt me? Or was this simply an opportunistic decision made in the moment, without considering the consequences? None of these explanations made the theft acceptable, but I was searching for some way to understand how my sister could have crossed such a fundamental line. The Jessica I knew was irresponsible with money and casual about debt obligations, but I had never seen her as someone who would commit outright fraud. This incident forced me to reconsider how well I really knew her character. 2 weeks after the Las Vegas incident, while I was still processing the implications of Jessica's theft, another concerning development emerged. I received a call from a department store credit card company, asking me to verify my identity for a new account application. According to their records, someone had applied for a credit card in my name using my social security number and address, but the phone number on the application was different from their record. When I explained that I had not applied for any new credit cards, the representative became immediately concerned. She informed me that the application had been approved, and a card had already been mailed to my address, but with a request for expedited delivery to a different location. The alternate address was an apartment complex in Scottsdale that I didn't recognize, but which was in the area where Jessica lived. This second incident removed any remaining doubt about Jessica's involvement in identity fraud. Using my information to apply for new credit cards was a federal crime that went far beyond the impulsive use of my existing card in Las Vegas. This required premeditation, planning, and a deliberate decision to assume my identity for financial gain. I immediately contacted the credit card company to report the fraudulent application and requested that the account be closed before any charges could be made. I also placed fraud alerts on my credit reports with all 3 major bureaus and began the process of monitoring my credit more closely for any additional unauthorized activity. The psychological impact of discovering that Jessica was systematically stealing my identity was profound. This wasn't just about money anymore, it was about trust, family, and the fundamental violation of my personal security. Jessica had access to my most private information because I was her sister, and she was using that access to commit crimes against me. I realized that I needed to confront Jessica directly about both incidents. But I also understood that this conversation would likely end our relationship as we knew it. Accusing your sister of identity theft and fraud isn't something you can easily come back from, even if the accusations are true. I decided to gather as much evidence as possible before having that conversation, both to ensure I was absolutely certain of the facts and to protect myself legally if the situation escalated. Over the next week, I conducted a thorough review of all my financial accounts, credit reports, and personal information. What I discovered was far worse than I had imagined. The Las Vegas incident and the department store credit card were just the beginning of Jessica's identity theft activity. In the previous 6 months, someone had used my information to apply for at least 5 different credit cards, with varying degrees of success. 3 applications had been approved, resulting in active accounts that I knew nothing about. 2 had been denied, likely due to the debt-to-income ratios that were being calculated based on my legitimate existing accounts. Most shocking was the discovery that several of these fraudulent accounts already had significant balance. Someone had been actively using credit cards in my name to make purchases for months, and I had been completely unaware because the statements were being sent to alternate addresses that Jessica had provided during the application process. The total amount of debt that had been accumulated in my name exceeded $15,000 across multiple accounts. These weren't small, impulsive purchases like the Las Vegas trip, but systematic and ongoing fraud that had been carefully orchestrated to avoid detection. Jessica had been living partially off of credit accounts opened in my name while simultaneously avoiding repayment of the legitimate money she owed me. As I documented each fraudulent account and transaction, I began to understand the sophisticated nature of Jessica's scheme. She had used her detailed knowledge of my personal information, gained through years of sisterly intimacy, to create a comprehensive identity theft operation. She knew my social security number, my mother's maiden name, my previous addresses, and all the other details typically required for credit application. More cleverly, she had been careful to use alternate addresses and phone numbers for the fraudulent accounts, ensuring that I wouldn't receive statements or notification calls that might alert me to the theft. The alternate addresses were often mail forwarding services or temporary apartments, making it difficult to trace the fraud back to her directly. The psychological manipulation was perhaps even more disturbing than the financial theft. Jessica had continued to interact with me normally throughout this period, asking about my life, sharing family news, and maintaining the facade of our sibling relationship. She had looked me in the eye during family gatherings while knowing that she was actively stealing my identity and damaging my financial reputation. I also realized that her casual attitude toward repaying the legitimate loan now made more sense in this context. If Jessica was already stealing thousands of dollars from me through identity theft, the few $100s per month she was supposed to be paying back probably seemed insignificant. Why struggle to repay a legitimate debt when you're already committing much more serious financial crimes against the same person? The discovery of the full extent of Jessica's identity theft forced me to make some difficult decisions about how to proceed. From a legal standpoint, I had clear grounds to file criminal charges against her. Identity theft and credit card fraud are serious felonies that can result in significant jail time and permanent criminal records. The evidence I had gathered would be more than sufficient to support prosecution. However, the thought of sending my own sister to prison was devastating. Even given the severity of her crimes against me, I knew that a criminal conviction would destroy her marriage, her business, and any chance she had of rebuilding her life legitimately. It would also tear apart our family and create lasting damage that might never heal. At the same time, I couldn't simply ignore what had happened. The financial damage to my credit and the ongoing risk of additional theft meant that I needed to take strong action to protect myself. I also couldn't trust that Jessica would stop her fraudulent activities voluntarily, especially since she had been escalating her efforts over time. I decided that my first step should be a direct confrontation with Jessica, giving her one opportunity to acknowledge what she had done and work with me on a solution before I involved law enforcement. I hoped that facing the reality of her crimes and their potential consequences might motivate her to come clean and make things right without the need for criminal prosecution. I arranged to meet Jessica for coffee at a neutral location where we could have a private conversation without family members or her husband present. I brought copies of all the fraudulent account statements and credit reports showing the unauthorized activity. My plan was to present the evidence calmly and give her a chance to explain herself before discussing potential solutions. Jessica arrived at the coffee shop looking relaxed and cheerful, apparently having no idea what our conversation would entail. She chatted casually about her business and asked about my work, maintaining the same friendly demeanor she had shown throughout the period when she was stealing my identity. Her ability to compartmentalize her criminal behavior while acting normal in our relationship was both impressive and deeply disturbing. When I finally steered the conversation toward the reason for our meeting, Jessica's demeanor changed dramatically. As I laid out the evidence of the fraudulent credit cards and identity theft, I watched her face cycle through surprise, denial, anger, and finally resignation. Her initial response was to claim that she had no idea what I was talking about, but the specificity of the evidence made that position impossible to maintain. Eventually, Jessica admitted to what she called borrowing my identity for a few credit applications, when her own credit had been damaged by missed payments on her business loan. She claimed that she had always intended to pay back any money she spent and make sure that my credit wasn't damaged by her activities. In her mind, she was temporarily using my good credit rating to help herself through a difficult period, with plans to resolve everything before I ever found out. This explanation revealed the fundamental flaw in Jessica's thinking about money and ethics. She seemed to genuinely believe that intentions mattered more than actions, and that her plans to eventually make things right justified the criminal behavior in the meantime. She appeared shocked that I viewed her identity theft as a serious betrayal rather than a creative solution to her financial problems. When I explained the legal consequences of what she had done, Jessica became defensive and angry. She accused me of being rigid and unsympathetic to her struggles, pointing out that I had always been financially successful while she had faced constant challenges. She suggested that my willingness to involve law enforcement showed that I cared more about money than family relationships. This response crystallized my understanding of how differently Jessica and I viewed financial responsibility and family obligations. In her mind, family members should support each other unconditionally, even if that support involved overlooking illegal behavior. She seemed to believe that my financial stability created an obligation to absorb the costs of her poor decisions without complaint. From my perspective, Jessica's crimes had violated the most basic principles of trust and respect that should govern any relationship, but especially family relationships. The fact that she was my sister made her behavior more hurtful, not more excusable. Her access to my personal information was a privilege that came with the responsibility to protect my interests, not exploit them. Our conversation continued for over 2 hours, but we were unable to reach any real understanding or agreement about how to move forward. Jessica alternated between minimizing the seriousness of her actions and blaming me for not being more supportive of her financial struggles. She seemed unable or unwilling to acknowledge that identity theft was fundamentally wrong, regardless of family relationships or financial circumstance. As our meeting ended, I gave Jessica a clear ultimatum. She had 2 weeks to provide me with a comprehensive plan for paying back all the money she had stolen, closing all the fraudulent accounts, and repairing any damage to my credit. If she couldn't present a realistic solution within that time frame, I would have no choice but to report the identity theft to law enforcement and let the legal system handle the situation. Jessica's response was to ask for more time and to suggest that we should involve our parents in finding a family solution to the problem. She seemed to believe that our parents would pressure me to be more forgiving and help her avoid the legal consequences of her actions. This suggestion revealed that she still didn't understand the seriousness of the situation or the extent to which her behavior had destroyed my trust. I left our meeting feeling emotionally drained and increasingly convinced that Jessica would never voluntarily take responsibility for her crimes or make genuine efforts to repair the damage she had caused. Her responses during our conversation had shown a continued pattern of minimization, blame shifting, and manipulation that suggested she viewed herself as the victim rather than the perpetrator. Over the following 2 weeks, Jessica made several attempts to contact me with partial solutions and requests for additional time. She proposed payment plans that would have taken decades to resolve the debt, suggested that I should consider the fraudulent charges as advances against her existing loan balance, and asked me to accept responsibility for some of the debt in the interest of family harmony. None of her proposals addressed the fundamental issue of the criminal behavior or showed genuine acknowledgement of the harm she had caused. Her suggestions continued to be based on the assumption that family relationships should override legal and ethical considerations, and that my financial stability obligated me to absorb the consequences of her poor decision. As the deadline I had set approached, I realized that Jessica had no intention of taking meaningful responsibility for her actions. Her responses had been designed to buy time and manipulate me into accepting a partial solution rather than addressing the full scope of her crime. I began to prepare for the possibility that I would need to pursue legal remedies to protect myself and ensure accountability. The decision to involve law enforcement in a family matter was one of the most difficult choices I had ever faced. I understood that taking this step would likely end my relationship with Jessica permanently and create lasting division within our family. However, I also recognized that allowing her criminal behavior to continue unchecked would enable further victimization and send the message that family relationships could be used to escape accountability for serious crime. 3 days before my deadline expired, Jessica made one final attempt to avoid legal consequences. She appeared at my apartment unannounced, accompanied by her husband Ryan with what she called a final offer for resolving our situation. Ryan had apparently been unaware of the full extent of Jessica's identity theft, and his presence suggested that she was finally taking the situation seriously. Their proposal involved Ryan taking out a personal loan to pay back a portion of the stolen money immediately, with the remainder to be paid through a structured settlement over several years. In exchange, I would agree not to pursue criminal charges and to accept partial responsibility for the situation by acknowledging that I should have been more careful about protecting my personal information. While the financial aspects of their offer were more realistic than Jessica's previous proposals, the requirement that I accept partial blame for her crimes was completely unacceptable. I had not been careless with my personal information. I had been victimized by someone who exploited family trust to commit identity theft. Accepting responsibility for Jessica's criminal behavior would have validated her distorted view of the situation and potentially compromised my ability to protect myself from future fraud. I declined their offer and informed them that I would be filing criminal charges the following week if Jessica did not voluntarily surrender herself to law enforcement and provide full cooperation in resolving the fraudulent account. At this point, I had lost all confidence in Jessica's willingness to address the situation honestly or completely without legal pressure. Ryan's reaction to this news revealed that he was finally beginning to understand the seriousness of his wife's actions and their potential consequences for their future together. He asked several pointed questions about the evidence I had gathered and the likelihood of successful prosecution. His legal concerns seemed to carry more weight with Jessica than anything I had said during our previous conversations. That evening, I received a phone call from my mother, who had apparently been contacted by Jessica and Ryan about our situation. My mother's perspective on the conflict was exactly what I had expected based on Jessica's request to involve our parents in finding a solution. She believed that family problems should be resolved within the family and that involving law enforcement would create permanent damage that wasn't worth any amount of money. My mother's call forced me to articulate clearly why I believed criminal prosecution was necessary despite the family consequences. Jessica's behavior wasn't just a financial disagreement or a mistake in judgment, it was a systematic pattern of criminal activity that had been carefully planned and executed over many months. Treating it as a family matter would minimize the seriousness of identity theft and enable Jessica to continue believing that her actions were justifiable. Moreover, I explained to my mother that my identity and credit had been compromised in ways that could affect my financial security for years to come. The fraudulent accounts would remain on my credit reports, potentially affecting my ability to get loans, buy a house, or even secure employment in the financial industry. These consequences were too serious to be resolved through family discussions and partial payment. My mother listened to my explanation but continued to hope that some compromise could be reached that would avoid criminal prosecution. She offered to help mediate a family meeting where all parties could work together on a solution. While I appreciated her desire to preserve family relationships, I had already given Jessica multiple opportunities to resolve the situation voluntarily, and those efforts had been unsuccessful. The conversation with my mother crystallized my understanding that proceeding with criminal charges would indeed divide our family, potentially permanently. Jessica would likely position herself as the victim of my unwillingness to forgive, and other family members might side with her based on emotional loyalty rather than legal and ethical consideration. I would have to accept that protecting myself legally might cost me important family relationships. However, I also realized that maintaining relationships based on enabling criminal behavior and accepting victimization wasn't healthy or sustainable. If family members expected me to absorb the consequences of Jessica's crimes in order to preserve family harmony, then those relationships were already damaged beyond repair. True family support should include holding each other accountable for harmful behavior, not covering it up. As I prepared to contact law enforcement, I reflected on how drastically my relationship with Jessica had deteriorated from the initial loan disagreements to systematic identity theft. The progression revealed a pattern of escalating financial manipulation that probably would have continued if I hadn't discovered the fraudulent account. Jessica's willingness to exploit family trust for criminal gain suggested that our relationship had been fundamentally different in her mind than it had been in mine. The decision to pursue legal action wasn't just about recovering the stolen money or protecting my credit, it was about establishing clear boundaries and consequences for criminal behavior. Allowing Jessica to escape accountability would have sent the message that family relationships could be used to commit crimes without serious consequence. That precedent would have been dangerous, not only for me, but potentially for other family members who might become targets of her financial manipulation in the future. The morning I walked into the police station to file a formal complaint against Jessica felt surreal. Detective Sarah Martinez, who specialized in financial crimes, listened carefully as I explained the situation and presented the extensive documentation I had gathered. Her expression remained professionally neutral, but I could see her surprise when I mentioned that the perpetrator was my twin sister. Detective Martinez had seen many identity theft cases, but she explained that family-perpetrated fraud often presented unique challenges for both the victims and the legal system. The emotional component made these cases particularly difficult to prosecute, as victims sometimes changed their minds about pursuing charges when faced with the reality of sending a family member to prison. As we reviewed the evidence together, Detective Martinez confirmed what I already knew. Jessica's crimes were serious felonies that could result in significant prison time if she were convicted. The systematic nature of the fraud, the multiple accounts involved, and the substantial dollar amounts would likely result in charges at both the state and federal level. Identity theft was taken very seriously by prosecutors, especially when it involved such extensive financial damage. The detective also explained the process of how the investigation would proceed. They would need to contact each of the fraudulent credit card companies to gather additional evidence and documentation. Jessica would be arrested and charged, likely within the next few weeks. There would be court proceedings that could stretch on for months, during which time I would need to be available to testify about the fraud and its impact on my life. Most importantly, Detective Martinez made it clear that once I filed the formal complaint, the legal process would largely be out of my control. Even if I later decided I wanted to drop the charges, the prosecutor's office would make the final decision about whether to proceed with the case. The criminal justice system wasn't designed to accommodate family reconciliations or changes of heart. Walking out of the police station that day, I felt a mixture of relief and dread. Relief that I had finally taken decisive action to protect myself and hold Jessica accountable for her crime. Dread about the inevitable family consequences, and the knowledge that our relationship would never recover from this point. Within 48 hours of filing my complaint, the ripple effects began. Jessica called me in tears, having been contacted by Detective Martinez about the charge. She alternated between begging me to reconsider and expressing anger that I had betrayed her by involving law enforcement. Her emotional manipulation was transparent but still difficult to endure, especially when she claimed that criminal charges would destroy not only her life but also her marriage and her chances of ever rebuilding her business. Ryan called separately, his tone more controlled but equally desperate. He offered to liquidate their savings and take out additional loans to pay back the entire stolen amount immediately if I would ask the prosecutor to drop the charge.
When I explained that the decision was no longer entirely mine to make, he became frustrated and accused me of being vindictive rather than seeking genuine justice. The most painful call came from my father, who had been contacted by Jessica and Ryan about the situation. Dad had always been the peacemaker in our family, and he struggled to understand how financial disagreements had escalated to criminal charges. He asked me to consider the long-term consequences for our family relationships and wondered whether there might still be time to find a solution that didn't involve the legal system. During that conversation, I had to explain to my father exactly what Jessica had done and why it constituted serious criminal behavior rather than simply a family financial dispute. He seemed shocked by the extent of the fraud and the systematic way it had been carried out. By the end of our conversation, he acknowledged that Jessica's actions were indeed criminal, but he still hoped that family intervention might be possible. My mother's reaction was more complex. Initially, she focused on the family harmony aspects and urged me to consider forgiveness as a healing path for everyone involved. However, when I walked her through the specific details of how Jessica had used our family relationship to gather the personal information necessary for identity theft, she began to understand the deeper betrayal involved. The conversation that changed my mother's perspective occurred when I asked her to consider how she would feel if Jessica had stolen her identity instead of mine. The thought of having her credit destroyed, her financial security threatened, and her trust violated by her own daughter helped her understand why criminal prosecution was necessary regardless of family relationships. 3 weeks after filing the complaint, Jessica was arrested at her home. The local news covered the story because identity theft cases involving family members were unusual enough to warrant media attention. Seeing my sister's arrest reported on television was one of the most difficult moments of the entire ordeal, making the situation feel both more real and more final. Jessica's arrest sparked additional conversations within our extended family about the situation. Some relatives sided with Jessica, viewing my decision to pursue criminal charges as harsh and unforgiving. Others supported my position, recognizing that Jessica's behavior had been criminal regardless of family relationship. These divisions created lasting tensions that affected family gatherings and relationships for years afterward. The legal proceedings moved slowly through the court system, creating months of ongoing stress and uncertainty.
Jessica's attorney attempted to negotiate a plea deal that would involve restitution and probation rather than jail time. However, the prosecutor's office was reluctant to agree to a lenient sentence, given the extensive nature of the fraud and the sophisticated planning it had required. During this period, I learned more disturbing details about Jessica's criminal activities through the investigation process. Detective Martinez discovered that Jessica had been researching identity theft techniques online and had even purchased software designed to help create false identification documents. This evidence suggested that her crimes weren't impulsive mistakes, but part of a calculated plan to exploit family access for ongoing financial fraud. Even more shocking was the discovery that I wasn't Jessica's only victim. The investigation revealed that she had also attempted to use our mother's credit information to apply for additional accounts, though those attempts had been unsuccessful due to our mother's lower credit score and limited available credit. Jessica had apparently viewed family members as a resource for identity theft rather than targeting me specifically. This revelation was devastating for our mother, who realized that Jessica had been willing to victimize her own parents in addition to her sister. The knowledge that Jessica had attempted to steal from multiple family members shifted our mother's perspective completely, and she stopped advocating for family reconciliation in favor of legal accountability. The financial impact of Jessica's crimes extended beyond the immediate theft amounts. I spent months working with credit agencies and financial institutions to repair the damage to my credit report and close the fraudulent accounts. Even with documentation of the criminal charges, some creditors were slow to remove negative marks from my credit history, affecting my ability to qualify for favorable loan terms during that period. More frustrating was discovering that some of the fraudulent accounts had been sold to collection agencies before I learned of their existence. These collection companies continued to pursue payment from me, even after I provided proof of the identity theft and criminal charges. The legal process of resolving these issues required additional time and money that I shouldn't have had to spend. The emotional toll of the legal proceedings was significant. Preparing to testify against my own sister required me to relive the betrayal and document the specific ways her actions had harmed me. The adversarial nature of the legal system meant that Jessica's defense attorney tried to minimize her crimes and suggest that I was partly responsible for making my personal information vulnerable to theft. During depositions and court appearances, I had to maintain composure while listening to Jessica's attorney argue that her actions were motivated by financial desperation rather than criminal intent. These legal strategies were necessary parts of her defense, but they felt like additional violations of our relationship and attempts to avoid accountability for her choices. The trial itself was emotionally draining for our entire family. Jessica's defense strategy involved portraying her as a struggling entrepreneur who had made poor decisions during a period of financial crisis. Her attorney argued that family relationships should have provided opportunities for resolution without involving the criminal justice system. My testimony focused on the systematic nature of Jessica's fraud and the extensive planning it had required. I explained how she had used our family relationship to gather personal information and how her crimes had damaged both my financial security and my trust in family relationship. The prosecutor used my testimony to demonstrate that Jessica's actions weren't impulsive mistakes, but calculated criminal behavior. The most difficult part of testifying was maintaining my composure while looking directly at Jessica throughout my testimony. She appeared genuinely remorseful during the trial, and I could see that she was finally beginning to understand the serious consequences her actions would have for her future. However, I also knew that her remorse was likely motivated more by fear of conviction than by genuine understanding of the harm she had caused. Jessica's own testimony revealed the distorted thinking that had enabled her criminal behavior. She acknowledged that her actions were wrong but continued to minimize their seriousness and suggest that family loyalty should have prevented me from pursuing prosecution. Her inability to fully accept responsibility for her crimes, even during the trial, demonstrated why legal intervention had been necessary. The jury deliberated for 2 days before returning guilty verdicts on multiple counts of identity theft and credit card fraud. The convictions validated my decision to pursue criminal charges and confirmed that Jessica's behavior constituted serious crimes, regardless of our family relationship. However, watching my sister break down in tears as the verdicts were read was still emotionally devastating. Jessica's sentencing hearing occurred 6 weeks after her conviction. The judge considered several factors, including the systematic nature of her crimes, the substantial financial damage, and her lack of any previous criminal record. Character witnesses, including some family members, testified about Jessica's positive qualities and asked for leniency in sentencing. I was given the opportunity to provide a victim impact statement during the sentencing hearing. This was my chance to explain directly to the judge how Jessica's crimes had affected my life beyond the immediate financial damage. I focused on the violation of trust, the damage to family relationships, and the ongoing anxiety about financial security that resulted from having my identity stolen by someone I had trusted completely. The judge ultimately sentenced Jessica to 18 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. She was also ordered to pay full restitution for all fraudulent charges and to complete community service focused on financial literacy education. The sentence was more severe than her attorney had hoped, but less than the maximum penalty she could have received. Jessica's reaction to the sentencing was a mixture of relief that she wouldn't serve the maximum possible time and devastation about the prison sentence and its impact on her marriage and business. Ryan announced that he would wait for her during her incarceration, but their relationship was clearly strained by the legal proceedings and the publicity surrounding her crimes. The day Jessica reported to federal prison was emotionally complex for our entire family. Despite everything she had done, watching my sister begin a prison sentence felt tragic and final. Our parents struggled with conflicting emotions of disappointment and Jessica's choices and sadness about the consequences she would face. Chose not to visit Jessica or correspond with her during her incarceration. The legal proceedings had provided closure regarding her crimes, but I wasn't ready to attempt rebuilding a relationship that had been so fundamentally damaged by her betrayal. The prison sentence gave both of us time to process what had happened and consider whether any kind of future relationship would be possible. During Jessica's imprisonment, I focused on rebuilding my financial security and moving forward with my life. The restitution payments helped cover the immediate costs of her fraud, but repairing my credit and restoring my sense of financial security took much longer. I also invested in identity monitoring services and took additional precautions to protect my personal information from future theft. The experience of being victimized by family identity theft changed my perspective on trust and relationships in fundamental ways. I became more cautious about sharing personal information, even with close family members, and more vigilant about monitoring my financial accounts for suspicious activity. These changes weren't necessarily negative, but they represented a permanent shift in how I approached financial security. 6 months into Jessica's sentence, I received an unexpected letter from her through her attorney. The letter contained what appeared to be a genuine apology for her crimes and an acknowledgement that her actions had been wrong regardless of her financial circumstance. She expressed understanding of why I had pursued criminal charges and indicated that she didn't expect forgiveness or reconciliation. More significantly, the letter contained information about additional fraudulent accounts that she had opened in my name, but that hadn't been discovered during the original investigation. Jessica provided account numbers and details that allowed me to close these accounts before they could be used, potentially saving me from additional financial damage. This voluntary disclosure of information that could have remained hidden suggested that Jessica was finally taking genuine responsibility for her crimes, rather than simply trying to minimize their consequences. However, I remained cautious about interpreting her motivations, as she had demonstrated a pattern of manipulation throughout our relationship. The additional accounts Jessica disclosed had been opened more recently and hadn't yet been used for significant purchases. Her decision to reveal them prevented further damage to my credit and demonstrated that she possessed information about fraudulent activities that went beyond what had been uncovered during the investigation. This revelation made me wonder whether there might be other victims or undiscovered aspects of her criminal behavior. Working with Detective Martinez to investigate the additional accounts, I learned that Jessica had been preparing for even more extensive identity theft before her arrest. She had gathered credit information not only from family members, but also from clients of her marketing business, who had provided personal information for legitimate business purposes. The scope of her planned criminal activities was broader than anyone had realized. This discovery led to additional charges against Jessica and extended her prison sentence by 6 months. More importantly, it revealed that her identity theft crimes weren't limited to family exploitation, but represented a broader pattern of criminal behavior that could have affected many more victims if she hadn't been caught and prosecuted. As Jessica's original release date approached, I faced the question of whether I was willing to consider any form of reconciliation or renewed relationship. Her behavior during imprisonment had been positive, with reports of participation in financial literacy programs and genuine efforts at rehabilitation. However, the extent of her criminal planning made it difficult to trust that her reform efforts were genuine rather than strategic. The decision about future contact with Jessica became more complicated when our father was diagnosed with a serious illness that would require family support during his treatment. The prospect of family gatherings and shared responsibilities raised questions about whether Jessica and I could coexist in family settings without resolved conflict affecting everyone else's well-being. My mother approached me about the possibility of a mediated family meeting after Jessica's release, with the goal of establishing ground rules that would allow family functions to proceed without ongoing tension. She acknowledged that full reconciliation might not be possible, but hoped that some form of civil coexistence could be achieved for the sake of family unity during our father's illness. These conversations forced me to consider what forgiveness and accountability meant in the context of family relationships damaged by criminal behavior. I had achieved legal justice through Jessica's prosecution and conviction, but the question of personal forgiveness and relationship repair remained unresolved. The prospect of our father's illness added urgency to these considerations that hadn't existed before. As I prepared for the possibility of encountering Jessica after her release from prison, I reflected on how the experience of being victimized by family identity theft had changed my understanding of trust, boundaries, and family loyalty. The legal resolution had provided validation and financial recovery, but the personal and family consequences would continue to affect relationships for years to come. The approaching end of Jessica's incarceration marked not just the completion of her criminal sentence, but the beginning of a new phase in our family's attempt to move forward from the damage her crimes had caused. Whether that future would include any form of relationship between us remained an open question that would require careful consideration of safety, trust, and the possibility of genuine change. Jessica's release from federal prison occurred on a cold February morning, exactly 18 months after her sentencing. I learned about her release not from family communication but from the victim notification system that had kept me informed throughout her incarceration. The knowledge that she was free again brought a mixture of anxiety and curiosity about what kind of person would emerge from the experience. According to our mother, Jessica had changed significantly during her time in prison. She had completed every available rehabilitation program, earned her GED equivalency despite already having a college degree, and participated in financial literacy counseling that addressed the thinking patterns that had enabled her criminal behavior. More importantly, she had apparently developed genuine insight into how her actions had harmed not just me, but our entire family structure. The first indication that Jessica's transformation might be genuine came through an unexpected source. 3 weeks after her release, I received a certified letter from a law firm I didn't recognize. Instead of being another legal complication, the letter contained documentation showing that Jessica had voluntarily signed over ownership of several assets to me as additional restitution beyond what the court had ordered. The assets included her small marketing business, which had been kept operational by Ryan during her incarceration, and a piece of property in Scottsdale that she had inherited from our grandmother years earlier. Combined, these assets were worth significantly more than the remaining debt from her identity theft. She was essentially paying me back far more than she had stolen, without any legal requirement to do so. The letter also contained a personal note from Jessica, written in her own handwriting rather than typed by attorney. She acknowledged that financial restitution could never truly repair the damage she had caused to our relationship and our family, but hoped that this gesture demonstrated her commitment to taking full responsibility for her actions. She specifically stated that she expected nothing in return and understood if I never wanted contact with her again. This voluntary restitution was shocking because it represented a complete reversal of Jessica's pre-prison attitude toward money and responsibility. The Jessica who had casually avoided repaying legitimate loans and justified identity theft as temporary borrowing would never have given away valuable assets without being forced to do so. The gesture suggested that her time in prison had fundamentally changed her understanding of accountability and repair. However, I remained cautious about interpreting her motivations. Jessica had always been skilled at reading people and providing responses that generated desired reaction. It was possible that this grand gesture was simply a more sophisticated form of manipulation, designed to rebuild trust so she could exploit it again in the future. The scale of her previous deception made it difficult to trust any apparent change in her character. My father's illness had progressed during Jessica's incarceration, and he was now requiring regular medical treatments that brought our family together frequently. These hospital visits and medical appointments created unavoidable situations where Jessica and I would need to be in the same space if we were both going to support our father during his health crisis. Our mother arranged the first family meeting since Jessica's release to occur at the hospital during one of our father's treatment sessions. The neutral medical environment seemed appropriate for a reunion that carried so much emotional complexity. I agreed to participate because our father's well-being was more important than my personal comfort, but I insisted that the meeting focus on practical arrangements rather than emotional reconciliation. Seeing Jessica again after nearly 2 years was jarring. Prison had aged her in ways that went beyond the passage of time. She appeared smaller, more subdued, and carried herself with a cautious humility that was completely different from her previous confident demeanor. When she spoke, her voice was quieter and more measured, lacking the animated enthusiasm that had always characterized her personality. Jessica's approach to our reunion was careful and respectful. She didn't attempt to hug me or act as though nothing had happened. Instead, she maintained appropriate distance and spoke only when directly addressed. Her focus remained entirely on our father's medical situation and how she could contribute to his care without creating additional stress for the family. During that first meeting,
Jessica provided practical information about her living situation and employment that demonstrated her commitment to rebuilding her life legitimately. She had moved into a modest apartment and found work at a nonprofit organization that helped formerly incarcerated individuals transition back into society. Her salary was significantly lower than what she had earned in her previous marketing career, but the work aligned with her rehabilitation goals. Most importantly, Jessica didn't ask for forgiveness or attempt to minimize what she had done. She acknowledged that her crimes had permanently damaged our relationship and that any future contact would need to be based on my comfort level rather than family expectation. This approach was completely different from her previous pattern of manipulation and suggested that she had indeed developed genuine insight into the harm she had caused. Over the following months, as our father's treatment continued, Jessica and I developed a functional working relationship, focused entirely on his care. We coordinated schedules, shared information about his medical needs, and collaborated on practical decisions without addressing our personal history. This limited interaction allowed me to observe her behavior and assess whether her apparent changes were genuine or performed. What I observed was consistent with genuine transformation. Jessica never attempted to use our father's illness as emotional leverage to rebuild our personal relationship. She didn't try to position herself as the devoted daughter who deserved forgiveness because of her current dedication to family care. Instead, she focused entirely on being helpful in practical ways, while respecting the boundaries I had established. The breakthrough moment in my assessment of Jessica's transformation came during a particularly difficult day in our father's treatment. He had experienced complications that required emergency surgery, and our family spent nearly 24 hours at the hospital waiting for information about his condition. During this crisis, Jessica's behavior revealed the depth of her character change. Throughout that long day and night, Jessica took care of practical needs without being asked. She arranged for food delivery to the hospital, coordinated communication with our father's employer and insurance company, and managed dozens of small details that allowed our mother and me to focus entirely on the medical situation. Her assistance was invaluable, but she provided it without drawing attention to her contributions or using them to generate gratitude. More significantly, when our father's condition stabilized and the immediate crisis passed, Jessica quietly removed herself from the family celebration. She recognized that her presence during emotional moments created additional complexity for everyone else, and she prioritized our family's comfort over her own desire to participate in the relief and joy of our father's recovery. This pattern of selfless assistance, combined with appropriate self-removal, convinced me that Jessica's changes were genuine rather than strategic. The person who had stolen my identity and manipulated family relationships for personal gain would not have been capable of such consistently thoughtful behavior without expectation of reward or recognition. 6 months after our father's health crisis, I made the decision to have a direct conversation with Jessica about the possibility of limited relationship repair. I wasn't ready for full reconciliation, but I wanted to acknowledge the genuine changes I had observed and explore whether some form of sibling relationship might be possible in the future. Our conversation took place at a coffee shop, the same type of neutral location where I had confronted her about the identity theft years earlier. However, the dynamic was completely different this time. Jessica listened carefully to everything I said without becoming defensive or trying to redirect the conversation toward her own perspective. She acknowledged that rebuilding trust would be a long process and that she had no right to expect forgiveness regardless of her efforts to change. Most importantly, Jessica provided a complete and honest account of her criminal thinking and behavior that went far beyond what had been revealed during the legal proceeding. She explained how her financial desperation had gradually overcome her ethical boundaries, and how she had justified increasingly serious crimes by telling herself that she would eventually make everything right. This conversation revealed that Jessica's identity theft had been even more extensive than the investigation had uncovered. She had been researching ways to assume my identity completely, potentially moving to a different state where she could live as me, while leaving me to deal with the financial wreckage she created. Her arrest had prevented the implementation of a criminal plan that would have destroyed my life entirely rather than just damaging my credit. Learning about the full scope of what Jessica had planned was terrifying, but her willingness to reveal information that could only make her appear worse convinced me that her commitment to honesty and accountability was genuine. She was providing this information not because she had to, but because she believed I deserved to understand the complete truth about what had happened. As our conversation continued, Jessica also shared details about her experience in prison and the rehabilitation programs that had helped her understand the psychological patterns behind her criminal behavior. She had worked with counselors to identify the thinking errors that had allowed her to justify stealing from family members, and had developed new decision-making frameworks designed to prevent similar choices in the future. Her description of this therapeutic work was detailed and insightful in ways that suggested genuine engagement rather than superficial compliance with program requirements. Jessica could articulate specific cognitive distortions that had enabled her crimes and explain concrete strategies she had learned for managing financial stress without resorting to illegal behavior. By the end of our conversation, I felt cautiously optimistic that Jessica had indeed changed in fundamental ways that made limited relationship repair possible. I wasn't ready to trust her with personal information or financial access, but I was willing to consider a gradual process of rebuilding some form of sibling connection based on consistent demonstration of her new values and boundaries. We agreed to begin with monthly coffee meetings where we could continue rebuilding communication and trust. These meetings would have clear boundaries, no financial discussions, no request for favors, and no pressure for deeper relationship development. Jessica would continue demonstrating her commitment to legitimate living and ethical behavior while I would gradually become more comfortable with increased contact. Over the following year, our monthly meetings evolved into a cautious but genuine relation. Jessica never violated the boundaries we had established and consistently demonstrated the character changes that had begun during her incarceration. She built a stable life through legitimate means, maintained steady employment at the nonprofit organization, and even began pursuing additional education and social work. The turning point in our relationship repair came when Jessica received an offer for a better paying position with a different organization. Instead of making the career change immediately, she asked if I would be willing to serve as a character reference for her application. This request demonstrated both her respect for my judgment and her understanding that rebuilding my trust was more important than immediate career advance. Providing a character reference for Jessica felt like a significant step in acknowledging her transformation while still maintaining appropriate boundaries. I was honest in my reference about her criminal history while also describing the genuine changes I had observed during her rehabilitation and reintegration process. The organization ultimately hired her based on her qualifications and demonstrated commitment to serving others. 3 years after Jessica's release from prison, our relationship had evolved into something resembling normal siblings who had overcome significant conflict. We maintained regular contact, celebrated family occasions together, and had developed new shared experiences that weren't overshadowed by our difficult history. However, certain boundaries remained in place, particularly regarding financial matters and personal information sharing. The most meaningful indicator of our relationship repair came when our father's health declined again, requiring end-of-life care decisions and coordination. Jessica and I were able to work together seamlessly to ensure he received the best possible care while supporting our mother through an incredibly difficult time. Our collaboration during this crisis demonstrated that we had successfully rebuilt trust and partnership despite our traumatic history. Our father's passing brought our family together in grief, but also in appreciation for the relationships we had been able to repair and maintain. During his memorial service, Jessica spoke about the importance of accountability and second chances, acknowledging that our family's ability to heal from serious wounds had been possible only because of our father's example of loving but firm expectations for ethical behavior. Looking back on the entire experience, from Jessica's initial identity theft through her imprisonment and eventual rehabilitation, I recognize that pursuing criminal charges was the right decision despite its painful family consequences. The legal intervention forced Jessica to confront the seriousness of her behavior in ways that family pressure alone could never have achieved. More importantly, the experience taught me valuable lessons about the difference between enabling harmful behavior and providing genuine support for positive change. By refusing to accept Jessica's crimes as acceptable family behavior, I had actually created the conditions that made her eventual transformation possible. Today, Jessica and I maintain a relationship built on honesty, respect, and clear boundaries, rather than the automatic trust that had enabled her previous exploitation. Our connection is different from what we had before her crimes, but it's also more genuine and sustainable because it's based on demonstrated character rather than family obligation. The financial restitution Jessica provided has long since been resolved, and my credit has been fully restored. However, the experience permanently changed my approach to personal security and family relationships in ways that have ultimately made me more careful and self-protective. These changes weren't entirely negative, as they helped me develop better boundaries and more realistic expectations for all my relationships. Jessica's transformation from identity thief to trustworthy family member demonstrates that people can change in fundamental ways, but only when they face real consequences for their actions and engage genuinely in the difficult work of rehabilitation. Her story also shows that second chances can be meaningful and successful when they're earned through consistent demonstration of changed behavior, rather than granted automatically based on family loyalty. The debt that Jessica accumulated in my name was ultimately far outweighed by the debt she chose to take on herself through voluntary restitution and genuine accountability. In the end, letting her keep that larger debt to herself, to her own conscience, and commitment to changed behavior, proved to be exactly the right decision for both of us. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.